hear me now. So our topic today on IHL, as you will all appreciate, is a key area of OCHA's work, and that is, as a custodian of IHL, we have a role to ensure these principles are upheld at all times in humanitarian crisis. And the reality of our work demonstrates that there are indeed many challenges to ensuring that IHL obligations are upheld and that people affected by crisis are protected and their needs are met. And to assist us to go deeper in this topic, to explore the issues and the OCHA context in working in IHL, I'm delighted to have Natalie Weisman, who's with us. Natalie is the Senior Legal Advisor in OCHA, and we're grateful, Natalie, for the time that you're making to be with us, to walk us through the session. And I know that we will benefit greatly from your rich knowledge and experience working in the area. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues Cecilia and Alfred, who are part of the facilitation team and who will be working with you for this session. It is a quick 1 hour, 5 minutes. It's a deep dive, and so I will now hand over to Cecilia, and I wish you all an enjoyable learning session. Thank you. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Jeanette, and a warm welcome on my side as well. I just would like to briefly review a few ground rules for this webinar. As we have heard just a minute ago, so the session will be an hour and 5 minutes. It is really meant to be interactive, so we do want to hear from you. You'll also hear from Alfred. Please have your device ready, and we'll be starting now. And Alfred, if you could please put the Mentimeter slide on, please. So we would like to know what is the one thing you hope to learn from today's webinar, and we'll ask you to put your inputs into a slide. But before this, I want to acknowledge that we received a few inputs from the survey. So I just want to go through some of the expectations that we received from you already. And I could see that most of the expectations are around getting a good understanding of IHL and its applicability in order to bring the right advocacy message to the government and to the various stakeholders. An interesting input that some of you brought to us is that this topic can feel at times very impenetrable, which is, I believe, it's very true for many of us. It's also one of the expectations that you mentioned is about obligations of international, regional, and national militaries, and how these obligations vary for non-formed groups and non-armed groups, non-state armed groups, and how the authorities understand the full humanitarian law spectrum. So these are some of the expectations. So we'll move now to hearing expectations from all the others who haven't had a chance to contribute to the earlier survey. Meanwhile, I also want to say that this session is being recorded, correct, Alfred? And that whoever doesn't want to enter or is not able, let's say, to contribute to the Mentimeter survey, please use chat. We keep on monitoring chat, and we will feed any comments to the facilitator. So, Alfred, if you could please put the slide on the Mentimeter on. Perfect. So now, what I believe that most of you are already very well familiar with the Mentimeter. You need to please put www.menti.com in your device and use the code. Alfred, don't please cover the code. I think you, voila. The code is 3571136, and we'll be looking forward to receiving your inputs. So what is the one thing you hope to learn from today's webinar? And we should be able to hopefully cover all of your doubts, all of your questions. So please take a couple of minutes to enter your comments. And as mentioned, please use chat if you're unable to use the Mentimeter. And please, Alfred, if you could also help me monitor the chat as you go. Okay, thank you. So we start to receive the first expectations, the first input here. So the first one is how humanitarian work with international humanitarian law. Okay, many thanks. Any other expectation, any other doubt or issue that you'd like to be covered? IHL and non-state armed groups. Perfect, thanks. We already mentioned that. What is my role and responsibility to uphold IHL as well as how the rights, as IHL. So this is another input. The rights of beneficiaries and the rights of humanitarian workers. I believe the third input is not complete, but anyway, it's about role and responsibility to uphold IHL. A brief framework of IHL. How does the IHL work with Humanitarian Coordination Department, OCHA's connection, advocacy and coordination for IHL, practical ways to ensure the IHL is implemented in daily work. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your expectations. I believe we have a very good starting point here. And with this, please keep on sending your expectations, but I would hand over this point to Natalie, who could start to address some of this, and maybe other colleagues can keep on contributing. So to you, Natalie, and thanks, colleagues, for contributing.
Hello, everyone, and can you hear me?
Yes, a bit low, if you could please.
Okay, I'll bring the computer closer. So unfortunately, I just clicked on camera. We should have tested that. It doesn't work. I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that. When I click on camera, it says we can't connect to your webcam.
Okay.
My webcam is built into the computer, so I'm sorry. The intention was that you might be able to see my face, at least briefly. But I'm sorry about that. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm excited to be speaking to you all today. Thank you all for joining and for your interest in IHL. It is always a delight for me to know that there are colleagues who are so interested as to dedicate this amount of time to a short webinar on IHL. I would like to say a few preliminary things. First, in the less than an hour that we have, there's only so much that we'll be able to cover, and I appreciate all the questions that you've sent in and the areas of interest that you have, and I do think that I can address a lot of it, but just consider this the beginning of a discussion. And you know, the good thing about the fact that we all work in the same organization is that you can email me, you can call me on Teams, we can have many more discussions, and I'd be happy to answer all your questions, even if I can't address them all during this webinar. A second point that I like to make at the outset of any presentation on IHL is that IHL typically disappoints. It's not international human rights law. It's not absolute. It's a balancing act. Every single rule of IHL, and we'll look into some of them, is a balancing act between military necessity of the parties on one hand and their interests, and humanity on the other. And each rule is a tug of war, is the result of a tug of war that states have come up with to allow parties, in particular states, because states negotiated this, to be able to fight the war that they have to fight while preserving humanity to the maximum, but while giving the parties to the conflict enough discretion to fight their war. So it's not absolute. There's a lot of judgment built into the rules, as you will see, and so be ready to be left a little bit uneasy because it is not as absolute as human rights law. But when you think about it, certainly I think it's remarkable that we should even have anything like international humanitarian law to apply in the chaos of war. I think it's remarkable, and it is law. It is widely recognized, and it remains compelling if you speak in IHL terms with parties. If you speak in IHL terms, you know, at high political levels at the UN, it remains compelling, even if it's true that on the ground we do see a lot of violations and you know, big humanitarian concerns as a result. Okay, so those are my main preliminary points. I hope that everyone can hear me. Again, I agree that this should be as interactive as possible, so please do send in questions as you feel the need to react or simply react, and we will have moments to interrupt the presentation to have interaction. All right, so I have the ball. Let's see here. Perfect. So today's aims hopefully overlap with many of the Mentimeter answers that you gave. The aims are to identify key areas of IHL that underpin our work. And I think another key area that I often find can lead to some confusion or a lot of questioning is, you know, how do we know whether there's an armed conflict in the first place? Because, of course, it's only in armed conflicts that IHL applies, and outside of armed conflicts, we have other bodies of law that kick in. Well, the human rights law applies at all times, but that's the principal one that will apply outside of armed conflict. And so I'll turn to that in a second section, because I think it's first important to know what the rules are that we're dealing with in IHL for you to then be interested in knowing when they apply. So those are the two aims, and again, ask questions and know that we have plenty of opportunity for follow-up after this if we can't address it all. All right, so this slide should be pretty basic, but needs to be said. Obviously, OCHA's mission, as many of your answers in the Mentimeter have already noted, is to mobilize and coordinate effective and principled humanitarian action, and of course advocate the rights of people in need. And of course, OCHA works in all sorts of situations of humanitarian crisis. We today are going to focus mainly on situations of armed conflict, and again, IHL applies only in situations of armed conflict and does provide a basis for those two areas of OCHA's work, humanitarian action in armed conflict and the protection of victims of armed conflict. Now, of course, there are other areas of OCHA's work that also overlap with IHL. I've selected these two because you are principally on the ground and maybe less interested in, say, how OCHA's policy work intersects with IHL, but there are many other areas, of course, that intersect with IHL in our work. All right, I'm going to jump straight to the core, I think, of everyone's work here, which is OCHA's work in facilitating and coordinating humanitarian activities. And IHL has a lot to say about this. The rules that I'm going to lay out for you are applicable in any kind of armed conflict and bind any party, whether state or non-state armed group. And this applies to pretty much everything I'm going to be telling you about IHL today. Most of the most fundamental rules of IHL apply to any type of party. So you, off the bat, you don't need to worry about that at the moment. So IHL, and this is probably the most, perhaps the most underappreciated rule, is that IHL recognizes in any type of armed conflict that an impartial humanitarian body can offer humanitarian services to the parties to an armed conflict for the benefit of those who are not fighting. So this means that in any type of armed conflict, including a non-international armed conflict, which necessarily means that non-state armed groups are a party, one or more groups are a party, that a humanitarian organization can offer humanitarian services, whether it's to bring relief, whether it's to offer protection services, the full range. Again, this means that IHL recognizes that engagement with all parties is acceptable and is allowed for humanitarian operations to be carried out. And so this is a very, very important starting point when IHL applies for all of our colleagues in the field who need to engage not only with government authorities, but also with armed groups. And this has proven a useful point in the field. In my experience, I can recall a number of offices, heads of office, or even humanitarian coordinators writing and saying, please give me the legal basis for my ability to approach an armed group so that we can start negotiating access. And of course, a negotiation is going to, turn on much more than IHL, but it has helped heads of office and other colleagues to feel equipped and solid going into a conversation, that they know that IHL allows them to do this explicitly. It's also helpful vis-a-vis a government to be able to say, look, we consider that there's an armed conflict in this situation. Often it's not very controversial, but sometimes it is. And as you know, IHL allows us to engage with all parties. We will need to be engaging with the other side now, and those conversations need to be had and are being had, for example, in Colombia at the moment, and any day now in Mozambique, northern Mozambique. Once offers of humanitarian services are made to the parties, what is also quite clear is that the consent of the state needs to be obtained before any humanitarian organization can carry out operations on its territory. And that's even if the operations are in areas that are solely held by armed groups. There's debate over this question, but the Office of Legal Affairs of the UN has made it crystal clear that for any UN or UN implementing partners, the consent of the state is needed. Once we have that consent of the state, all parties, state, non-state, all parties have an obligation, it's their burden, to allow and facilitate passage and allow freedom of movement of humanitarian personnel. This doesn't just mean sort of letting us through, but it actually means facilitating. It means ensuring that visas are expedited, that travel permits are expedited, that customs clearances are expedited, that hours of operation for key offices are made clear and are, practical. There are all sorts of very practical implications of this. You'll see in brackets I've mentioned a right of control. That's because that's sort of a first indication of that I'm giving you of the fact that there's a balancing act here. And so the obligation to allow and facilitate passage is there, but not without the possibility for a party to interrupt passage for valid reasons, for legitimate reasons, because there's fighting that they can't interrupt because they don't want humanitarians to get in the way of fighting or fighting to get in the way of humanitarians. But limitations have to be circumscribed. They have to be limited in, restrictions have to be limited in time and in geography, and mustn't impede humanitarian operations overall. Of course, there's also an obligation to respect humanitarian personnel and assets. That means not attacking them, not harassing, not kidnapping, not looting, not destroying. And this, unfortunately, is something that we see quite a bit, and despite the fact that it is absolutely prohibited under international humanitarian law. I've given you some examples already of how it relates to work on the ground, but I can give you, another example of a time, this was in Ukraine maybe 2 years ago now, where OCHA and other humanitarians have been engaging both, of course, with the government, but also with authorities, de facto authorities in eastern Ukraine. And there was a point in time when the government was not happy with the manner in which the UN was engaging with the armed groups in the east. It accepted that there could be engagement, but wasn't happy with the form that it was taking because they considered that it was a bit too formal. And so this is where it was, of course, first important to acknowledge that IHL does recognize the permission to engage with all parties, but also IHL says that this engagement with all parties, including armed groups, doesn't change their legal status. And so it's not because we engage with armed groups that this gives them some higher legitimacy or recognition or legal status. It is a practical need, an operational relationship that needs to be had in order to bring assistance or other services to civilians under their control. Of course, the ERC delivers statements on a regular basis to the UN Security Council and very often refers to the IHL obligation to allow and facilitate passage and ensure freedom of movement in different contexts. For example, on Yemen, pretty much every month there's a reference to that in his statements to the Security Council. There are other examples that I can provide, and we can get into them later, but I'm going to move on to the next area, if that's okay, because we don't have a very big amount of time left. I hope that that's okay. All right, and the next big area in which we do a lot of advocacy, as you know, and you've already alluded in many of your reactions to the Mentimeter and also beforehand in the survey, and that's in the area of protection of victims of armed conflict. Now, at OCHA, and I think in the UN generally, we really focus on civilians, on people who are not fighting and who have never fought and aren't typically expected to take up arms and fight. But it's important to know that IHL also protects fighters who are no longer fighting, either because they're wounded or sick, because they've surrendered, because they've been captured. And while we at OCHA typically don't cover those areas much, it's important to know that IHL really does aim to protect all those who are not fighting. If you're not fighting, you are entitled to protection. So that's what this slide tries to capture without necessarily going into it. Now, the main rules that we tend to deal with and advocate are obviously the rules of distinction, proportionality, and precautions, which I hope sounds familiar to you. Distinction is the most fundamental of all. It says that attacks by any party to an armed conflict can only be directed against military objectives and fighters, not civilians or civilian objects. And IHL provides a good definition of what is a military objective, and anything that doesn't fall under that definition cannot be attacked. And I won't get into the specifics now because there's a lot to cover, but I can provide the definition to you later. And what's interesting is that the definition of a military objective is not absolute. It can depend on the circumstances. So today, a certain object might be a military objective that is a legitimate target of attack, but tomorrow it might not be. Proportionality is another key rule that demonstrates the balancing act that IHL tries to achieve, because it says that even when a party is going to launch an attack against a military objective, it still needs to consider the impact, the incidental effects on civilian objects and civilians, and refrain from launching that attack against a military objective if the incidental civilian harm is expected to be excessive compared to the military advantage that is expected from the attack. And so there's a weighing exercise being done for every attack to determine whether the harm that is incidental to civilians or civilian objects is going to be excessive. And that, I'm sure many of you are wondering, who decides? How do you decide? What's the equation? It's an area of immense debate, and a lot of writing, a lot of discussion has been had. For the purposes of this discussion, just know that if you're feeling uneasy, that's perfectly normal. This is what IHL does. It tries to achieve a balancing act and does leave quite a bit up to the judgment of the parties. Precautions is a really important one, and probably my favorite, because I think that you can never have too many precautions. And so it's always a very good argument to have in your pocket. Precautions, the obligation to take precautions is hopefully self-evident, but IHL requires that all parties take all feasible precautions. So again, the word feasible suggests that today something might be feasible but not tomorrow. Feasible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian harm. And so even if you can only carry out an attack against a military objective and the harm against civilians, the incidental harm cannot be excessive, you still have to take precautions to determine the best timing, the best type of weapon, the best angle, the best axis, the sort of all sorts of different parameters to try and minimize civilian harm. There's an obligation to give warnings when feasible so that civilians can get out of the way, for example. And again, what's interesting about this is that it's on the one hand, it requires only what is feasible, but feasible can really change over time. And once you learn from an experience, you can then improve your practice. And so precautions, I think, bring a lot of potential for advocacy. And I think another important point is that precautions also need to be taken by those under attack, the defending party, to also try and remove civilians from areas where there might be military objectives. They have to not place military objectives where civilians are located. They need to set up all sorts of sort of alert systems, evacuation systems to protect those under their control if they come under attack. So precautions are a big area of sort of potential for extra protection, I guess, protection measures for civilians. Importantly, as I've said, there are protections for the wounded and sick and for medical personnel and assets and facilities. We could go into all of that, but again, I'm conscious of time and questions and more to say, so I will skip over that for now. And then just turn to how some of this figures in OCHA's work. So this is perhaps less operationally relevant and more relevant in terms of advocacy, in terms of representations with governments, with armed groups, and even at very high political levels at the UN here in New York. But pretty much in any ERC statement that comes across my desk on situations of armed conflict, the ERC will speak to the protection of civilians. Recall that IHL imposes an obligation to respect and protect civilians and civilian objects. Just last week, for example, the ERC gave a statement to the Security Council on the link between armed conflict and food insecurity and famine. And in that statement referred to a number of rules of international humanitarian law that aim to actually defend against hunger in situations of armed conflict. And it referred, of course, to the key rules of distinction, proportionality, and precautions, but there's also prohibition of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, and there's also a prohibition on attacking, destroying, or rendering useless objects that are indispensable for the survival of the civilian population, such as agricultural land, livestock, water facilities, etc. And on water facilities, just to give you a very concrete example of how these rules are applicable, I see at least some of you might be covering Syria, but right now in northern Syria there is a water station that is not fully functional. It is under the control of Turkish and Turkish affiliated parties, but serves civilians outside of the Turkish and Turkish affiliated parties' area of control, and so this is a key instance in which we can argue, not that it necessarily wins the day, but the argument is there, that a party to a conflict must not use starvation as a method of war against civilians, but also must not render useless objects that are indispensable for survival. And so even if civilians are not under their control, they can't just sort of abandon the water facility and not have it maintained and repaired when we know that it's indispensable for the survival of hundreds of thousands of people just on the other side of the line. So this is one of many arguments that can be made. Again, there are also public communications campaigns that you might have seen over the years that refer to the protection of civilians and key IHL rules. So these are rules that recur in a lot of our advocacy work, and I'm sure that you will have your own examples of how all of this comes up. I think we are now due for a break.
Yes, Natalie, and thanks so much, because you really provided a rich set of examples of how the IHL relates to OCHA's work on the ground and also on the protection of victims of armed conflict. But as you said, we want to hear from you now. So if we could turn to the Mentimeter engagement piece, as we call it, we would like to hear from you what are the examples that you can share? So how does the IHL feature in your own work, especially as it relates to these two areas that Natalie just described, so humanitarian activities and the protection of victims of conflict? And you've seen that Natalie provided some very good examples, but let's hear from you and your own context. So what are some of the examples that you can bring? What has been your involvement, your personal direct involvement or indirect as part of the office and the office activities? So please let us know. Use the same code. You don't need to enter it again. You just need to input your contributions, and let's see. We are looking forward to having a bit of engagement and discussion. And meanwhile, Alfred, if you could help me monitor the chat. Whoever cannot use Mentimeter, please go on chat.
In the meeting, there were 2 questions or comments in chat.
Yeah, you're right. And maybe as we wait for colleagues to bring their input, Natalie, we had a question from one of our colleagues, Delphine. Engage in dialogue with armed groups. Can you refer us to a few OCHA's regulations that offer a clear way to engage a dialogue related to humanitarian access or protection of civilians? So this is the question that came from Delphine. But meanwhile, yeah, we are receiving some of the examples. And the first one is about OCHA's trust funds, SERV and CBPS, provide life-saving humanitarian emergency relief assistance to people in need. So this is one example in which IHL figures in humanitarian financing related work. Thanks for the colleague who shared this. Let's see if there are other inputs. Access, yeah, access is a very good example of relation with the IHL, and now IHL is translated into concrete work. Deconfliction, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
please feel free to also maybe provide in bracket the country from which you are providing this example, if you wish so. So we have delivery mechanism. How to distinguish between affected population and party to conflict during a humanitarian response. Thanks. Coordinating humanitarian actions and advocate for the rights of people in need. Yep. OCHA, alongside other partners, advocate against ill treatment. Then I don't see the rest. Yeah, of prisoners, detainee members of the non-state armed groups, especially children in Nigeria.
Okay.
Humanitarian access, as well as the dialogue with authorities related protection issues. Yeah, thank you, colleagues. I think, Natalie, in the interest of time, maybe you want to start addressing some of these examples, and maybe the colleagues can continue to provide more if they feel so.
Sure. Oh, and you can still hear me, yes?
Yes.
So perhaps to very briefly answer Delphine's question, there's nothing necessarily readily available online, but as I said, first of all, the starting point is international humanitarian law whenever we're in a situation of armed conflict, which explicitly recognizes that an impartial humanitarian organization can offer its services to any party for the benefit of those who are not fighting. But I think what you're looking for is more than that, and we have, which I can send to you. I'm making a note for myself. I can send to you a document that we have put together with colleagues. It's a frequently asked questions document on all sorts of aspects of engagement with armed groups, including legal basis, policy basis, and some practical dilemmas and how they might be addressed. So I can forward that to you, and if you're interested in discussing that and have more questions, we certainly can discuss it, and I can also connect you with other colleagues who deal with more operational aspects of the issue. I hope that helps. As for the answers to the first engagement question, it's very helpful to see just how much you perceive IHL being a part of what you do. And yes, one of you mentioned deconfliction, or what we're now trying to call humanitarian notification, to move away from the military notion of deconfliction, but we're talking about the same thing. There's been a lot of unfortunate confusion, or sort of convenient confusion, over what humanitarian notification is vis-a-vis international humanitarian law, and basically it adds nothing and subtracts nothing from or to IHL, but relies on it. And so humanitarian notification is simply a mechanism by which OCHA and other humanitarians inform the parties to an armed conflict of the location of humanitarian facilities, or the movement of humanitarians, and in some cases other objects as well, as more civilian, non-humanitarian objects. Depends on the context. But many parties have many partners, even sort of UN colleagues have often misunderstood this, or wanted it to be more than it is, by suggesting that once something is notified, that it must never, ever, ever, ever be attacked or harmed incidentally. But as I just said, when we discussed distinction, proportionality, and precautions, what is not a military objective today could be tomorrow, depending on its use, depending on the circumstances, depending on the value, sort of its use and the value to the attacker of attacking it or damaging it. And so what might be a humanitarian facility today, when front lines shift and facilities might be abandoned or might be taken over by a party, unfortunately, that the label that we will have given it of humanitarian may well change, and not to mention that the rule of proportionality does not prohibit altogether incidental harm to civilian objects, but only tries to minimize it. And so it is not because something is notified to the parties that damage or destruction of it is necessarily a violation. But this is something that is very hard for partners to accept. And the way I try to describe it is by saying it's basically the equivalent of a marking. You're essentially saying this is here. It's the equivalent of putting a red cross on the roof of a hospital. But unfortunately, even if there's a red cross on what is genuinely a hospital, IHL does not prohibit attacking it in all circumstances. There are circumstances in which even a hospital could potentially be attacked. So it's a marking, and it's another way of just saying this is here for the parties to factor it into their military operations so that they can apply distinction, proportionality, and precautions, knowing that this is there. There's a lot more that can be said about this, but I'm glad that you raised notification, because it's one that elicits a lot of discussion and unfortunate confusion. I think I need to move on to our next area, though.
Yeah, Natalie, maybe just to mention a couple of other comments that came through the chat. So the first one is from Julie. How does IHL apply to access to the people in need in armed conflict areas where the government has been declared them as terrorist group? And the other one, it's a quick one, is in terms of advocacy and negotiation, what's the difference between role of OCHA and ICRC? And then I believe, yeah, we should probably move on.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's really important to go back to offers of humanitarian services. As I've just said, IHL recognizes that offers of humanitarian services can be made to any party, and it does not, I'm going to be really blunt here, it does not care what label the government has given the armed group. You might expect that to a government, any armed group is going to be terrorist. IHL does not care about that. It says if a group is a party to a conflict, then IHL gives a humanitarian organization the entitlement to offer services. So legally speaking, under IHL, terrorist or not terrorist does not matter. That being said, operationally, politically, it becomes very, very difficult, of course, to convince a government whose consent we need to be on their territory to allow us and accept such engagement. But this is where negotiations happen and where some of the dilemmas that I just mentioned in response to Delphine arise. And again, this is where a lot of colleagues, including in civil military coordination and our access advisors here in New York and others, have a lot to say on various ways in which we can overcome those difficulties and dilemmas. It's a very real one. I don't want to dismiss it in the least, but only to say, because we're talking about IHL this morning or this afternoon, that IHL does not care about labels that are given to parties to conflict. It only cares that there is a party to a conflict, and that there are people in need in their power that for whom humanitarian services are being offered. And then, yeah, the differences between OCHA and ICRC are immense. I don't know where to begin, and I'm conscious of time, but
yes, probably. Sorry to interrupt. I believe we probably can move on, and then we can address this question maybe as a follow-up. What do you think?
Yeah.
Apologies
yes,
this time.
And I mean, there's an infinity of differences. Okay, good. So normally when you study IHL in school, you start with this question. You don't end with it, but I'm going to end with it because hopefully I've made you more interested than you already were in applying IHL. And now I want to say be careful, because it doesn't always apply. And unfortunately, I can't see where all of you work. You're probably all in areas of armed conflict, but I can't see. But many times a week, a month, I have to remind my colleagues that as much as they want to invoke IHL, sometimes they can't, because there's no armed conflict in the areas in which they are working, or because we haven't actually decided to say so publicly, which is a separate question, and a delicate one and a complicated one at the UN. But I want to just drive home the point that as you move around in the world, before you jump to speak of IHL, as great as an instinct as it is, ask yourself if there's an armed conflict to begin with. And I should also say that a lot of parts of the UN use the term conflict loosely because they don't know that there's a test for it. And it's not because there's violence that there's an armed conflict. So this is where I want to say it doesn't depend on whether a head of a peace mission has said it. It doesn't depend even on whether, you know, the spokesperson of the SG has accidentally said it. It doesn't depend on whether a government denies it. It depends on the facts on the ground. And so the test for an international armed conflict is really quite easy. It's whether there's any use of force between two states or more. So that's the first place to start. Is there fighting between two states or more? Yes or no? If no, we don't have an international armed conflict. I should pause here to explain that there are two types of conflict, international, and then the next one, which is non-international, which involves armed groups. And we distinguish between the two types of armed conflict because the rules under treaties are different. They are in different treaties. That being said, as I said at the outset of this presentation, for our purposes today and for most of the fundamental rules, the rules are actually the same in both types of armed conflict. But the reason why we distinguished the two is essentially because the treaty rules are found in different books. They're in different texts. So non-international armed conflict, which is probably, you know, for those of you in armed conflict, you're most probably in a non-international armed conflict. Here, unfortunately, the test is a lot trickier. Still depends only on the facts of the ground, and we're looking for two criteria. We're looking to see whether the group or groups involved are sufficiently organized and whether the hostilities are sufficiently intense. And there are many, many indicators that have been proposed by courts to determine whether a group is sufficiently organized and whether the hostilities are sufficiently intense. Again, this is really just an introductory IHL session, so I don't have the time to get into it, but there's a lot that I can offer you if ever you're wondering. And I can tell you that this has come up, for example, in northern Mozambique, as I mentioned earlier, fighting with ISIL-affiliated groups has significantly intensified. Their level of organization seems incredibly sophisticated, and it does seem as though there is an armed conflict between those groups and the armed forces of Mozambique. But the UN has yet to speak openly in IHL terms and armed conflict terms to talk about the need to provide assistance and other services to civilians under the control of armed groups. In Colombia, we have a similar issue. Speaking of the ICRC has uniquely been very vocal about the existence of 5 armed conflicts, non-international armed conflicts in Colombia, but the UN so far as to speak of 5 conflicts, and then relatively new head of office there has been trying to find a way of getting the UN to speak in terms of all 5 conflicts, because what that does is it triggers IHL, it allows us to engage with armed groups, as I said at the outset, and invoke very specific rules of IHL, which we've looked at, for the benefit of civilians under the control of armed groups. So that's the sort of practical implication of that. I also want to just mention that there is a need to distinguish between armed conflict and other situations of violence in which IHL does not apply. But of course, human rights law applies at all times, both in armed conflict and outside of armed conflict. And so it's not as if we are in a vacuum if we're not in an armed conflict. We always have international human rights law. And sometimes, as I said, the UN might not be ready to say that there's an armed conflict. And so I want to say that it's not because there's no armed conflict that we can say nothing. We can, A, always speak in international human rights law terms, but B, we can also just speak in more vague terms that can fall either under IHL or under international human rights law, so that we don't preclude either a situation from being sort of possible. And this is something that we've done in the Anglophone, for the Anglophone parts of Cameroon, where there's still debate over whether there is or isn't an armed conflict, and we don't want to undermine anyone's position, and so we've developed advocacy messages that go to the humanitarian concerns and to key obligations of the parties that are applicable in any kind of situation under both IHL and human rights law. So there are ways of crafting messaging and advocacy to meet the specifics of the situation, even if sometimes we're not ready to say that there's an armed conflict. And I think we have to interrupt again. And
yes, Natalie, just want to flag a question from Reem. What about proxy wars / internal conflict in the case of Syria? And then we move on. Okay,
well, I mean, where to begin? I don't know what the question is exactly, except that there's still armed conflict, and the question then is whether the influencing parties are also parties or not. Like, is Iran, also a party? I don't know. I mean, the others are pretty. They're using force. The U.S. is using force. Russia is also using force. So it's not tricky there. For example, in Yemen, Iran's role, the U.S.'s role, they're less. They're more remote, and so there's a big question as to whether they're also a party or not. But in any event, there's what is my favorite provision of IHL, which is Common Article 1. It's Article 1 of all 4 Geneva Conventions, and it says that all states have an obligation not only to respect IHL, but also to ensure respect for IHL. And while there's some debate over it, the U.S., for example, won't agree that it's a legal obligation, but others do. We argue that this obligation to ensure respect means that any state, whether a party or not a party, has to use its influence where it has it to ensure that parties to conflict respect IHL. So, for example, in your reference to proxy wars, where a state might not actually be using force, but might be refueling fighter jets, sending arms, training armed groups, they have to use their influence to ensure that those that they're supporting respect IHL. So that's it in a nutshell, but we could talk a lot more about this if you're interested.
Yeah, and I can see that there is actually interest from participants that continue to write with questions, and some are also asking whether there will be more IHL sessions in the future. So definitely there is an interest. But in the interest of time, I just want to flag to the colleagues online. So we will probably need another 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and I hope you can stay with us. Meanwhile, I can see that Alfred has already put this slide on. So we were wondering about the challenges. Now, I don't know if we have practically the time to deal with the challenges. Natalie, would you prefer that we talk about the challenges, or that we move on to the international humanitarian law, the IHL and the interconnection with human rights law?
If we have 10 minutes, we probably have a little bit of time, because I think that was just the last slide, wasn't it?
All right. Yeah. Okay, so let's hear then from you again on the challenges. So we have heard again a lot of interesting examples and applications, but of course there are challenges on the ground, and we want to hear from you. And the first one that we have received is from a colleague, I don't know which country, but a large number of combating parties to the conflict and constant change of authorities and control. So this is one of the challenges that was flagged. And yeah, let's see if on chat we have any more. Alfred, I can't see the chat.
No, I don't see there's anything in chat. No.
Attacks against humanitarian personnel. Yes. Any more inputs, any more challenges that you're experiencing on the ground? It is poorly respected by parties, usually, and game rules are changing when world powers try to change the norms. Natalie, this is a complex one. Should we start to address maybe these ones as we...
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, these are, you know...
And attacking the humanitarian aid shipments.
These are all the reasons why, you know, we continue to advocate as loudly and as often as we can. And I certainly can't offer solutions except the conviction that we need to keep advocating, because it's what we have, and it's miraculous that we have it. And right now, I think the world is in a particularly pitiful state of compliance and respect for norms. But if we don't continue to advocate, then I think we'll be in a much worse situation. I can also tell you that there is constant thinking and discussion being had on what more can be done to ensure compliance and enhance accountability for violations. It's a constant thing, and in fact, I can tell you that Mark Lowcock has said that he's taking a lot more interest in the question of accountability, and so to prepare for an inevitable discussion that he's going to want to have on that, I'm compiling an endless list of initiatives that have been taken over the past 20 or so years to enhance compliance and accountability. I mean, so many like you, humanitarians and even legal experts are thinking about this. So without having answers, this is the key challenge that we have. But and when you think about it, there are not that many of us on the planet who actually have the role of advocating and trying to uphold IHL. So considering the small proportion of people on the planet who actually work on this, I'd like to think that our influence is actually pretty impressive. Yeah.
Good. Should we move to the next one?
No, we have three more. Three more inputs.
Sure.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
Natalie probably gives them from the screen. Is about it is poorly respected by parties. Yeah, this is already we have said this.
Okay.
Lead discussion with authorities about humanitarian assistance. Need to negotiate with a number of parties to get access.
I mean, these are without question the recurrent challenges that we are aware of, and so I think another point is that very quickly we see how we have IHL, and it gives us a foundation to do our work and a framework to have dialogue with authorities, but we need a lot more. We need tactics. We need negotiation. We need good practice. We need we need to exchange information on what's worked and what hasn't, and that's where many colleagues of mine come in to share that kind of guidance to help colleagues through these challenges. But IHL in itself doesn't resolve them, right? It's sort of the basis for our action. It allows us to feel a bit more solid going into things, knowing that IHL is on our side.
Yeah. Thanks for these preliminary answers, as you mentioned. Yeah, I think these are definitely issues and questions to be followed up more in depth. Thanks, Alfred. Let's move to the last piece of engagement. So this is a bit of a knowledge test or a fun test. So how do you think the IHL, International Humanitarian Rights Law, interacts? Just again, please submit your answer through the Mentimeter.
And more than one can be correct, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Natalie. And this will give Natalie the entry point then to speak a little bit in the next probably 6 to 7 minutes about the interactions of the two bodies of law. So please, any idea? Okay, so we have the first response. Two response, and three. So far, those who responded believe that the IHL overlaps with human rights law in some areas, and some other things that both are applied in situations of violence. So we have 7 respondents so far. So 2 believe that both are applied in situations of violence, and 1 thinks that they are 2 separate bodies of law. Okay, Natalie, please, if you can shed some light.
Sure. I mean, certainly the first 2 are both correct, and the third is also correct depending on, I mean, third is also correct. No one's wrong here. It's just that IHL doesn't apply in just any type of situation of violence, but only in what is an armed conflict, and we just looked at the test. So all are correct, and they're definitely 2 separate bodies of laws. They're in completely separate treaties. They've been drafted at different times for different purposes. Importantly, I think IHL, as we've just seen, applies to any type of party, whether armed group or state, where international human rights law has been established to bind states, not private persons or companies or armed groups. That being said, there's been an evolution since the drafting of human rights treaties, and there's now increasing acknowledgement that, for example, armed groups that have a government-like function and control over territory have human rights responsibilities as well. Yes, there's absolutely overlap between IHL and human rights, and please stay on this page for a second, but just to say that the next slide that I'll show you shows where there is some key overlap. And it's that very overlap that allows us to craft messaging in those trickier situations where we don't want to say if there's an armed conflict or not, or we don't do our assessment yet, or maybe we just don't want to upset government or undermine other systems. And so the fact that there's no overlap allows us to craft messaging that could go either way. And I'll show you what those areas are. And of course, they both apply in situations of armed violence. IHL applies in situations which are clearly situations of violence, and it applies at all times, both in situations of armed conflict and outside of situations of armed conflict in relation principally to law enforcement operations. And I think also just what's important is that in situations that are not armed conflict, in situations of armed conflict, IHL has much more specific rules than international human rights law does. And so while we say that international human rights law apply in armed conflict, it's colored by, it's informed by the specificity of IHL. So yes, so we were there. IHL doesn't apply just in any situation of armed violence, but armed conflict. And as I've said, international human rights law applies at all times. And this is what I think is our last slide, other than resources, that gives you a very quick look at how the two overlap or don't overlap. And so, for example, I'd like to focus on the areas of commonality. Both very clearly prohibit torture and other forms of ill treatment. Both very clearly require fair trial rights for anyone who's accused of a crime. In fact, the provisions in Additional Protocol 1 on this are very, very, very similar to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights under human rights law. They were written around-ish the same time, I think. Well, one came after the other, but still, they're very similar. So there's definite overlap. And then, of course, IHL foresees the obligation to evacuate, treat, and care for the wounded and sick, while international human rights law recognizes a right to health and adequate standard of living, which refers to housing and food. That overlaps with the obligations of parties to meet the essential needs of civilians under their control and allow and facilitate humanitarian assistance for civilians under their control. There are also references to education, both under IHL and, of course, a right to education under human rights law. So there are definitely areas in common that we can work with when we need to, and of course, use international human rights law in all the other situations in which OCHA works where there is no armed conflict. And so I don't want to minimize at all the role that international human rights law plays in our work as well. It's just that it wasn't the focus of today's webinar. And I think I'll leave it at that because we've run out of time, and maybe just tell you, I don't know if you'll be able to get this PowerPoint because there are hyperlinks in these areas in blue.
Yeah, we will. We will get to PowerPoint, okay. Yeah.
So that for those of you who are interested in a little bit more, but not too much more, we have fact sheets on some of the key issues that OCHA works on that show you what the key rules are and how they might relate to our work, and help you, sort of have a quick reference for key messaging if ever you need it. And of course, the first two are references to treaties and to customary IHL obligations. And frankly, this is what I tell colleagues in New York who sort of need a quick reference to IHL, but the ICRC study on customary IHL has a list of all the key rules of IHL that apply pretty much in any kind of armed conflict. And that means that you don't have to worry about whether the treaty applies, whether the conflict is international or non-international. You can just kind of look at that list of rules and know that pretty much for all of them, there are a few exceptions. Those rules apply in the armed conflict that you are in. So it's a really useful shortcut. My friend runs this project in Geneva at the ICRC, and often likes to tell me about all the clicks that it gets in New York, and I'm pretty sure they're all mine, because that's how often I'm there. So I hope that this has been helpful, but I don't know if we have more time for questions, but perhaps I can give you my email address.
Yes.
If you want to reach out, please do. I'm more than happy to pursue all your very interesting and valid and compelling comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. This has really been a very rich session, and I'm grateful also for the colleagues for the little patience. And I'm aware we ran over time. So Alfred, if we could quickly go on to polling, we have a last polling for you. It will probably take just 1 minute of your time, but we're interested to have your input. And with this, I want to thank everyone for attending this workshop. And Natalie, this is really a great starting point for us who wanted to know, really to have a good basis of IHL, and you gave us a lot of hints to actually get deeper in our exploration of this huge field of interest, which is so much important for the work of OCHA. So thank you again, and hopefully we can maybe host a follow-up, more in-depth session at any time soon, also based on the interest and the demand of the colleagues in the field. So thank you, everyone. Apologies for the running over of time, and have a very good rest of your days and of your day and your afternoon. Many thanks, and thanks, Alfred, for supporting.
Thank you all very much.